Welcome to Aircraft, your gateway to thrilling HFY sci-fi stories where humanity stands strong among the stars. Here, you'll experience epic encounters with alien civilizations, moments of human courage, intelligence, and the unstoppable spirit that makes humanity unique. Every story on this channel is narrated by a real human voice, not AI, bringing you a more authentic and immersive storytelling experience. If you love sci-fi adventures and stories where humanity proves its worth in the universe, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
There is a record, sealed in the Conclave's deepest archives, that no species is permitted to read without a psychological clearance rating of 7 or above. It is not a record of a war. It is not a record of a massacre or a plague or the death of a star. It is a single observer's report, filed by a Velshani diplomatic attaché named Orcs, third-ranking non-combat designation, assigned to what should have been a routine extraction mission. The report was flagged on arrival, not for classified content, not for strategic intelligence. It was flagged because the Conclave's senior psychologists, after reading it, determined that it constituted a trauma document, and that distributing it without preparation could destabilize junior personnel who had never encountered humanity in the field. I have clearance level 9, and I have read it 4 times. What follows is what Orcs saw, and what it cost them to understand it. The evacuation alarm had been screaming for 6 minutes when Orcs first saw the human. Not heard about one, not reviewed a file, saw one, a real living specimen of Homo sapiens, in the corridor of Waystation Hevel 9, moving in the opposite direction from every other creature on the station. Everyone else was running toward the docking bays. The human was running toward the explosion. Orcs recorded this in their field log with the practiced detachment of a diplomat trained to observe without judgment. They noted the human's height, approximately 1.8 Vel units, which their species considered average, but which struck Orcs as architecturally inconvenient for the corridor's low-clearance maintenance hatches. They noted the human's equipment: a standard-issue engineering vest, a plasma cutter slung across one shoulder, a canteen dented on one side in a way that suggested it had been used as a blunt instrument at some point, and a secondary sidearm holstered in a position that no Velshani combat doctrine would have recommended. They noted that the human was not wearing a helmet. They did not note, at that point, why the human was running toward the explosion. It did not occur to them, yet, to wonder. Orcs' primary concern was the evacuation. The station had taken a collective suppression strike, technically illegal under the Conclave Compact of 3,400 cycles, but the collective had never particularly cared about the compact, except when it benefited them. 3 of the station's 6 docking arms were already venting atmosphere, but the remaining 3 were crowded with vessels in varying states of departure readiness, and Orcs had 17 diplomatic documents that absolutely could not fall into collective hands, a cultural aide named Veth, who was currently hyperventilating into a pressure mask, and a deepening suspicion that they were not going to make it to their assigned vessel. The human passed them at speed, not running the way Velshani ran, the long, careful, weight-forward lope that Orcs' species had evolved for savanna efficiency. The human ran the way Orcs imagined a piece of debris rolled down a slope. Not graceful, not calculated, all forward momentum, and very little apparent concern for what it was going to hit at the bottom. Its boots hit the deck plating with a rhythm that was almost aggressive. Its arms pumped, but it made a sound as it passed, a low, almost rhythmic exhalation. And Orcs would later spend considerable time trying to determine whether that sound was a breathing technique, a vocalization, or something else entirely. It was singing, they would eventually determine. The human was singing as it ran toward the explosion. Orcs watched it go. Then they looked at Veth, who had stopped hyperventilating long enough to watch the human disappear around a corridor bend. Then they looked back at the direction of the explosion, then at the docking bays. Then, against every instinct, every protocol, every piece of diplomatic training they possessed, they followed the human. They would not be able to fully explain this decision in the report. They tried. 4 separate drafts, each deleted. And the closest they came was a single line that survived into the final document. I followed because I needed to understand what I had seen, and I understood that if I did not follow, I never would. The corridor was thick with smoke. Orcs' secondary respiratory membrane filtered most of it, but the particulate matter still registered on their chemical sensory array. Burning polymer, hot metal, the sharp mineral tang of a coolant rupture, and beneath it all something organic and acrid that they identified with some delay as human perspiration. The human had been here, recently and at speed. They found it. Found her, they would correct themselves in the report after reviewing the human's personnel file, in the junction chamber at the end of the maintenance corridor. The chamber was on fire. Not catastrophically. Not yet. A secondary conduit had ruptured along the port wall, and the plasma leak had ignited the insulation foam on the ceiling, and the ceiling was burning in a way that dropped occasional flaming pieces onto the deck, and the deck was very hot, and there was a Velshani maintenance technician trapped under a fallen support strut, and the human was in the process of lifting the strut. Not trying to lift it. Lifting it. The strut was rated at approximately 4 Vel units of mass. Orcs knew this because they had, in a previous posting, reviewed the station's structural specifications as part of a routine safety assessment. A standard Velshani adult could not lift one alone. The Velshani strength-to-mass ratio, while efficient, did not extend to moving objects of that class without mechanical assistance. The human lifted it, held it, and then said to the technician beneath it, in a voice that was calm in the way that moving water is calm, not still, but purposeful. "Can you move? I need you to move right now." The technician, Orcs, would later identify them as a junior maintenance officer named HFY, moved. They dragged themselves sideways across the burning deck with their 2 working limbs, and the human held the strut until they were clear, and then lowered it, not dropped it, lowered it, and then looked up and saw Orcs standing in the doorway. "You're not supposed to be here," the human said. "No," Orcs agreed. "Can you carry them?" The human nodded at HFY, who was trying and failing to stand. Orcs' species was not built for carrying. They were built for carrying information, for record-keeping, for the delicate management of diplomatic weight. But they had 4 functional limbs and an alien colleague bleeding onto a burning floor, and the human was already moving toward the plasma conduit with their plasma cutter unshouldered. So Orcs went to HFY and began the complicated physical process of helping someone considerably heavier than themselves toward the exit. Behind them, the human began cutting. "What are you doing?" Orcs asked. "Isolating the plasma flow," the human said. "If I don't, this section vents in about 4 minutes and takes docking arm 2 with it. There are about 60 people on docking arm 2. The station is being evacuated." "Not fast enough." Orcs considered this. Then, "There is a collective strike in progress. They have 6 suppression vessels positioned along the approach vector. A docking arm 2 may not be able to depart regardless of whether you seal the breach." "Yeah," the human said. The plasma cutter was throwing sparks that hit their bare forearms, and they did not flinch. "I know." There was a pause. Orcs processed several things at once. The weight of HFY against their side, the heat of the room, the sound of structural groaning somewhere above them, and the fact that the human had just confirmed they were doing a thing they knew might not save anyone. "Then why?" "Because it might," the human said. "Move. I'll catch up." Orcs moved. They were in the corridor when the explosion happened. Not the catastrophic one, a smaller one. A controlled release burst from the conduit that knocked Orish and Dow sideways into the wall and drove Hevral into their thorax with enough force to crack one of their secondary rib plates. The light in the corridor went briefly, catastrophically white. Orish and Dow's chemical sense went haywire. Everything smelled like burning and copper and something that registered in the very old, very deep part of their sensory architecture as danger, danger, danger. They waited. They would note, in the report, that waiting was not a rational choice. The rational choice was to continue moving toward the docking bays. But they waited, pressing themselves and Hevral against the wall, and they counted, in the old Velshani way, in heartbeats rather than cycles. And they reached 37 heartbeats before the human came around the corner. The human was on fire, minor fire. The left sleeve of their vest had caught from the conduit burst, and they were patting it out with their right hand as they walked, not ran, walked, down the corridor toward them. They were not screaming. They patted the fire out the way Orish and Dow might smooth a wrinkled document. The sleeve was gone below the elbow. The skin beneath was red. "Conduits isolated," the human said. "Docking arm 2 has about 20 minutes before the structural load becomes critical. Should be enough." They looked at Hevral. "Can they walk?" "I don't think so," Orish and Dow said. "Okay." The human bent down and did something that Orish and Dow could not at first parse. They scooped Hevral up, both arms under the Velshani technician's body, and then lifted them with the same matter-of-fact efficiency they might have used to pick up a piece of equipment. "Which bay are you assigned to?" "Bay 7, Orish and Dow said. "Bay 4 is closer. My ship's there. Come on." They walked. The human carried Hevral, who massed approximately the same as Orish and Dow, which was considerable. And they walked at a pace that was fast but not frantic, and the human was still making that low sound, still singing. Whatever the song was, it had no tactical value that Orish and Dow could identify. It was not a distress signal. It was not a communication. It was, as far as they could determine, just music. Just a human making music while carrying a wounded alien down a burning corridor on a station under attack. Orish and Dow did not know the word for what they were experiencing. Their language had many words for the observation of excellence, for the specific appreciation of a well-executed maneuver, for the intellectual satisfaction of a solved problem, for the professional respect of a colleague who performs above standard. They had a word, Veloroth, for the feeling of witnessing something that reordered your understanding of what was possible. None of those words fit. This was not excellence. Excellence was expected. Excellence was achieved. What the human was doing did not feel achieved. It felt innate. It felt as natural as breathing. And Orish and Dow had spent enough time near this human now to note that their breathing was still perfectly regular, still slow and deep and even. As if the burning, the explosion, the weight of an alien body in their arms, but the ongoing battle outside, as if none of it had touched some central, unhurried part of them. Bay 4 was chaos. 3 ships in various states of departure prep, crew shouting in 2 languages, a hegemony freighter trying to leave against traffic, sparks falling from a cracked ceiling conduit. The human's ship was a mid-class courier, battered, clearly repaired in at least 6 places that Orish and Dow could count from the entry ramp, with a name stenciled on the hull in human script that Orish and Dow's translation array rendered as second guess. The human carried Hevral up the ramp without slowing. Inside was another human, shorter, darker, currently arguing with the ship's navigation system in a dialect that Orish and Dow's translator struggled with. They looked up when the 3 of them entered. I took in the situation in approximately 1 second and said something in their own language that Orish and Dow's array translated as, "What did you do now, Reeves?" "Found some people," the human carrying Hevral, Reeves, said. They set Hevral down on a cot with extraordinary gentleness. "Can you get us out of here?" "I was trying to get us out of here before you went and found people," the other human said, but they were already moving toward the cockpit. "Are they injured?" "The Velshani, yes. The diplomat. I have a cracked secondary rib plate," Oroshandao said. Both humans looked at them. The second human's eyebrows went up. The expression was not one Oroshandao could immediately classify. Somewhere between surprise and something warmer. "A diplomat," they said. "You brought a diplomat onto my ship." "Your ship," Reeves said. "And is my ship. My ship that you borrow." "Ihejirika," Reeves said. "Can you please—" The station shook. Something large had hit something else large, and the resulting shudder moved through the deck plating and into Oroshandao's feet and up through their cracked rib plate in a way that was genuinely unpleasant. Hevral made a sound. Reeves put a hand on their shoulder, one brief, warm pressure. And Oroshandao watched the technician's distress coloration stabilize, just slightly, just a fraction. 1 hand, 1 second. "Strap in," Ihejirika said from the cockpit. "This is going to be terrible." It was, in fact, terrible. The departure from Bay 4 took 11 minutes, involved a near collision with the hegemony freighter, 2 collective suppression drones, and a maneuver that Oroshandao's navigation knowledge told them was technically impossible at their current speed inside a docking bay. Ihejirika performed it anyway, with an expression of intense focus and what appeared to be active enjoyment. And when they cleared the bay doors and the void opened ahead of them, cold and vast and lit by the distant burning of the collective suppression line, they said something in their own language that Oroshandao's array translated after a moment's delay as, "Still got it." Reeves was in the hold with them, already treating their own burned arm with a kit from beneath the cot. The burn was worse than Oroshandao had seen in the corridor. 2nd degree across most of the forearm, skin angry and blistered. At the kind of wound that a Velshani physician would classify as requiring immediate intervention and extended rest. Reeves cleaned it, applied the dressing, and made a sound that was brief and sharp, the only acknowledgement of pain they'd produced in Oroshandao's entire observation of them, and then moved on to examining Hevral. "You sealed the conduit," Oroshandao said. You knew it might not matter. That docking arm, too, might not be able to depart regardless." Reeves looked up. In the low light of the second guess's hold, their eyes caught the amber of the emergency strips along the floor. "Yeah. And you did it anyway." There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough to feel intentional. 60 people, Reeves said. Maybe it mattered. Maybe it didn't. But I'm not going to stand there and not try. They went back to examining Hevral's leg. "You okay? Besides the rib?" Oroshandao did not answer immediately. There was a word in Velshani, Oroshan, which referred to the specific unsettling sensation of observing a thing that reconfigured your understanding of reality, not violently, but the way a tide reconfigures a shoreline. Slow, inevitable, leaving the landscape unrecognizable by the time it was done. They were experiencing Oroshan. They were fairly sure it was only just beginning. "I am functional," Oroshandao said. Outside, the void burned with collective fire, and the second guess ran ahead of it, and somewhere in the station behind them, docking arm 2 was either departing or it wasn't, and 60 people were either alive or they weren't. Diane Reeves was already focused on the next problem as if the last one had simply concluded, filed, done. Oroshandao sat against the hold wall, their cracked rib plate aching, and watched the human work, and began to understand that they were in the presence of something their entire civilization had not prepared them for. Not a soldier, not a hero, just a human, doing what humans apparently did. They ran for 6 hours before the collective stopped chasing them. Orcs Dao spent most of those 6 hours in the hold, which was exactly large enough to be uncomfortable for 3 people and 1 injured Velshani technician. The second guess was not a diplomatic vessel. It was not, in several technical respects, a legal vessel. Orcs Dao noticed, during the long stretches between crises, that at least 2 of the ship's systems were running firmware that no recognized manufacturer had produced, and the life support array had been modified in ways that the original schematic would not have recognized. It worked. It worked well. It simply worked in ways that suggested someone had, at some point, sat down with the system and said, "This isn't good enough," and then made it better, without official permission or approved parts or anything except, apparently, determination. They learned this because Ihajirika told them. The second human, once the immediate threat had reduced to a low, manageable terror rather than an acute one, became talkative. This was not a word Orcs Dao had expected to apply to anyone in the aftermath of an attack. But Ihajirika moved through the ship with a restless, contained energy that had to go somewhere, and it went into words, into explaining things, into showing Orcs Dao the modifications with the proprietary pride of someone who had built something good out of something inadequate. "This coupling," Ihajirika said, pointing at a junction in the life support array that Orcs Dao could not have identified without the explanation, "is from a Keth atmospheric processor, completely incompatible with this system officially, but the pressure tolerance is about 3 times better, and if you modify the interface collar," a gesture at a component wrapped in what appeared to be a non-standard bonding material, "it locks in better than the original. Took me 6 weeks to get it right." 6 weeks, Orcs Dao repeated. 11 failed attempts, Ihajirika said, and with the tone of someone reporting a score they were proud of. 12 if you count the time the whole thing backfired, and I spent 2 days breathing recycled air that smelled like Keth agriculture waste. That is deeply unpleasant. It was character building, Ihajirika said, and something moved across their face that Orcs Dao's observation array categorized as humor, though the classification felt insufficient for the actual phenomenon. It wasn't just amusement. It was something more layered, the ability to look back at suffering and find it, not redeemed exactly, but useful, worth the cost, the kind of reckoning that Orcs Dao's people typically only achieved after formal philosophical processing. Ihajirika was doing it in passing, in conversation about a malfunctioning air system. Reeves was quieter. That Reeves moved through the ship the way water moved through a pipe, purposefully, with no wasted motion, arriving where they were needed before Orcs Dao had always quite understood they were needed. Hevral's leg, it turned out, was broken. Not a simple fracture, but a complex one, the kind that would have required immediate medical intervention on a properly equipped vessel. The second guess did not have a medical bay. It had a kit. Reeves used the kit and whatever knowledge they had accumulated in a life that had clearly involved considerable amounts of improvised emergency medicine, and by the time the collective pursuit had dropped off their sensors, Hevral was stabilized, sedated with something from the kit, and wrapped in a thermal layer. "You've done that before," Orcs Dao said. "Set bones?" Yeah. Reeves was cleaning the kit. Engineers end up doing a lot of things they're not technically supposed to do, especially out here. Out here meaning away from the core systems, away from anywhere that has a proper hospital or a certified medic or anyone who knows what they're doing. Reeves sealed the kit. You improvise, or you watch someone die. Once you've watched someone die because you didn't know how, you learn fast. Orcs Dao processed this. Your training included medicine? My training included propulsion systems and structural engineering. A pause. The medicine is extra, self-taught, more or less. It was the more or less that lodged in Orcs Dao's mind and stayed there, Not the self-teaching which Velshani culture certainly practiced, but the casualness of it. Or the way Reeves said it, the way one might say, I also read for pleasure, as an addendum, an afterthought, something added because it was useful and they had time, and the alternative was not knowing. Hevral woke briefly, 2 hours into the flight. They looked at Orishindao with the unfocused recognition of someone still partially sedated, and then they looked at Reeves, who was doing something to the hull monitor readout across the hold. Their coloration shifted. Velshani expressed shock through a pale wash across the secondary pigmentation layer, and that wash moved across Hevral's face and throat before they controlled it. The human, Hevral said. They carried you, Orishindao said. From the junction chamber. Hevral stared at Reeves. The strut was lifted. Ah, yes. That strut was... That wasn't... Hevral's translation struggled. That mass... I know. Hevral went quiet for a moment, watching Reeves, who had not acknowledged the conversation. Then, why? It was a simple question. Orishindao had been sitting with a more complex version of it for 2 hours. I don't know, they said. I'm not sure they could explain it either, not in terms we'd accept as sufficient. I asked a version of the question. They said maybe it mattered. That was the entire answer. Hevral closed their eyes. Their sedation pulled them back under slowly. Just before they went, we should have evacuated together. I was told humans don't... A drowsy search for the phrase. Don't run toward things. They do, Orishindao said. They absolutely do. I saw it. In the cockpit, Ihejirika was playing music. Orishindao could hear it through the partition, something with deep, rhythmic percussion and a melody that moved in ways their auditory mapping couldn't fully predict. It was not designed for their sensory range. It was designed for human hearing, human emotion, human whatever it was, that made humans need music during emergencies. Orishindao found, to their considerable surprise, that they were listening to it anyway. The collective pursuit had dropped off completely by hour 6, and Ihejirika had charted a course to the nearest conclave relay station, 3 days at their current speed. It was during the transition to cruise velocity, when the ship's vibrations settled into a lower, steadier frequency, that Reeves sat down across from Orishindao and said, You should eat something. Orishindao's secondary digestive processes had been in emergency suspension since the attack began. It was true that reactivating them would be advisable. Thank you, they said. Do you have anything compatible with Velshani biology? Check the left storage unit. We picked up some packets from a conclave supply depot 2 stops back. Should be labeled. Orishindao found the packets. They also found approximately 14 other food items in that storage unit, most of which appeared to be human in origin, several of which appeared to have been constructed or preserved using methods that Orishindao's food safety training flagged as questionable. There was a container of something that their chemical sensor identified as heavily capsaicin-laden. There was a flask of something that, on analysis, they registered as ethanol solution. Recreational grade, which was to say, a solvent. There was a dark, compacted substance in a foil wrapper that their sensor could not fully categorize and which smelled, through the foil, intensely of something Orishindao had no reference for. What is this? They asked, holding up the foil package. Reeves looked over. Beef jerky. It is preserved animal protein. Yeah. Preserved through dehydration and salt application. And a few other things. It's good, Orishindao said it back carefully. Their sensor was still processing the capsaicin container. And this? This registers as a neurotoxin. Chili sauce. It's not going to hurt you, I just don't know if your species can taste it the same way. Reeves thought about it. Do you have capsaicin receptors? I do not know what those are. Pain receptors, in your mouth, for heat. Oroshandao considered this for a long moment. "You are telling me," they said, "that this substance triggers pain receptors and you consume it recreationally. It's delicious. It triggers pain." "Yeah, but good pain." Reeves appeared to genuinely believe this was a clarifying statement. "You know how sometimes a thing is uncomfortable, but in a way that feels—" "No," Oroshandao said, "I do not know that. My species does not have a concept for good pain. Pain is a damage signal. It is not recreational." Reeves looked at them for a moment. Then they picked up the chili sauce and squeezed a small amount onto a piece of their own food and ate it. And then their eyes briefly watered, and their face did something complicated and pleased, and they made a sound that was not a word, but which clearly meant yes, exactly, that. Oroshandao watched this with the kind of intense attention they usually reserved for critical diplomatic negotiations. "Your species," they said, "consumes neurotoxins for pleasure, drinks solvents recreationally, preserves meat by removing all moisture and adding the toxic mineral compound that your bodies require in trace amounts, and you consider this," a gesture at the storage unit, "a normal food supply." "Pretty much," Reeves said. "And you evolved this." "Over a few 100,000 years, yeah. On a planet with active tectonic plates. Also, yes. And apex predators. We were the apex predators, technically, eventually." A pause. And it took a while. Oroshandao looked at the storage unit, then back at Reeves. Their chemical sense was still processing the capsaicin. Deep in their sensory architecture, in the part that had been doing its job since before their species had language, something was trying very hard to file humanity under a known category and failing. Apex predator, death world origin, voluntary consumption of neurotoxins and solvents, lifts objects above their rated strength class under stress, runs toward explosions, carries injured aliens through burning corridors and calls it just trying. There was a Velshani term, Velkanshori, which could be roughly translated as the thing that should not be but is. It was an old term from Velshani myth, from stories about creatures that did not follow the rules of the world they lived in, and not because they broke the rules, but because they had been built by a different set entirely. Oroshandao reached for the term and found it fit, imperfectly, but better than anything else they had. The next 2 days developed their own strange rhythm. The second guess was small enough that there was no real avoiding each other, and small enough that the absence of formality became, gradually, its own kind of structure. Ihejirika made food, actual prepared food from the storage unit's more bewildering contents, and it smelled extraordinary, and they gave Oroshandao a Velshani-compatible portion alongside it, without being asked, without ceremony, and told them what was in it in case any ingredient was a problem. It occurred to Oroshandao that this was the same instinct Reeves had shown in the burning corridor, the same reflex. Feed the people with you. Make sure they can eat. Check first. Don't assume. It was not elaborate. It was not heroic. It was the smallest possible version of care. And yet Oroshandao found themselves noting it in their field log. The small version, the unremarkable version, the version that cost Ihejirika nothing but awareness. They noted it because in their experience of the galaxy, 3 postings, 11 years of diplomatic service, contact with 14 species, they could not immediately identify another species that did it instinctively. Most species fed their own. Some, by treaty or courtesy, extended provisions to diplomatic personnel. None of them did it the way Ihejirika did it, which was to say, without calculation, without the beat of consideration. Just, here is food. Are you able to eat it? Good. The Hevral woke properly on the second day. Their leg was splinted and aching, and they were embarrassed about being carried, which expressed itself in an excessive formality toward Reeves that Reeves appeared not to notice or not to care about. Hevral wanted to know, very specifically and in detail, how Reeves had lifted the strut. Adrenaline, Reeves said. Hevral's translator produced the word, and their expression indicated it was not one they recognized in this context. "It's a chemical my body produces under stress," Reeves said. "It increases available muscle strength temporarily. Also pain tolerance, reaction time." "Your body has an emergency mode," Hevral said. "Sort of. An internally produced pharmaceutical response to crisis." "Yeah, basically." Hevral looked at Orcs. Orcs looked at Hevral. And the look communicated several things, all of which could be summarized as, "Yes, I know. I've been sitting with this for 36 hours. All humans have this," Hevral said. "All humans," Reeves confirmed. "Children?" "Yes. And this is standard. This is normal. This is not a medical enhancement or a combat modification. This is just biology," Reeves said. Hevral made a sound that Orcs recognized as the Velshani equivalent of needing a moment. They looked at the ceiling for a while. Then, "What are the side effects?" "After it wears off? Shaking, exhaustion, sometimes nausea. Your hands do this." Reeves held up a hand and let it tremble slightly. "Oh, for a while. Your body undergoes a crisis response and the aftermath is shaking. And then you sleep for a long time and you're fine. That is all. That is all." Hevral looked at their ceiling again. Their pigmentation did something slow and complex that Orcs had only seen in Velshani elders, the kind of color shift that came not from acute shock, but from a slow tidal adjustment to new information. A reordering. The colors of someone whose model of the world had just had to expand to accommodate something large. "I want to know," Hevral said carefully, "how long humans have had this response." "Evolutionary timescale," Reeves said. Hundreds of thousands of years. Since before you had spaceflight. Since before we had agriculture." Hevral's colors settled into something Orcs had no diplomatic training for. "Then you have been," Hevral said, "walking around the galaxy, with internal emergency crisis drugs that activate automatically, that make you stronger and faster and more pain tolerant, and no one—" They stopped, considered. "And no one told us." Reeves appeared to find this mildly funny. "I mean, it's in the xenobiology files, under Homo sapiens, stress response, adrenaline." "I am a maintenance technician," Hevral said flatly. "I do not read xenobiology files." "Fair enough," Reeves said. On the third day, they hit the relay station. And the relay station was exactly as safe and unremarkable as it should have been. Danand Orcs arranged their transfer to a conclave vessel, and Hevral was taken to the medical bay, and there were forms to fill out and diplomatic incidents to report, and a great deal of bureaucratic recovery work that Orcs was very practiced at. They stopped before boarding the transfer shuttle at the base of the second guess's ramp. Reeves and HFY were both there. Not ceremony. They were loading supplies, continuing their business, the way that people continue their business. Reeves had their burned arm in a proper medical dressing now, acquired from the relay station, and it looked better, and they were moving with the easy efficiency of someone who has forgotten they were injured because they have other things to do. "Thank you," Orcs said. Reeves looked up. You didn't need much help." "I had a cracked rib plate and an unconscious colleague in a burning building." "Right. But you were already moving. You followed in. You didn't run." Orcs considered this. "I wasn't certain why I followed." "Yeah, you were," Reeves said. They went back to their work. "You needed to see if it was going to work out. You couldn't leave without knowing." Orcs stood very still for a moment. Because that was true. That was exactly true. And they had not articulated it until now, and Reeves had named it in passing, the way HFY named the modifications to the life support system. as if understanding other creatures was as natural as breathing, as automatic, as unremarkable, as if it was just something you did. Orish and Dow boarded the shuttle. In their field log, still open, though they added one line, "I think they understand us better than we understand them. I do not yet know what to do with this." The collective blockade of Hevel 9 would last another 11 days before Conclave intervention forced a withdrawal. Docking Arm 2 departed successfully. 57 of its 60 occupants made it to the evacuation fleet. 3 were lost in a secondary strike that had nothing to do with the conduit Reeves had sealed. 57 people. Maybe it mattered, Reeves had said. It had. In the accounting that Orish and Dow kept carefully in their head where the diplomatic record didn't reach, it had. 3 years later, Orish and Dow was appointed to a position that had not previously existed. The Conclave called it the Human Liaison Office. It had been created, quietly, without formal announcement, with a particular institutional discretion that signals we should have done this earlier and we would prefer not to be asked why we didn't, in response to an accumulation of incidents in the preceding decade. Contact reports from 16 species. Field observations from 8 different sectors. A small and growing archive of documents like Orish and Dow's own, all flagged for psychological review, all describing variations on the same experience. An encounter with a human, under some kind of pressure, that had reconfigured the observer's understanding of what sentient life could be. The position was, as Orish and Dow's supervisor explained in the appointment briefing, primarily analytical. They would review contact reports. They would coordinate with human diplomatic representatives. They would compile data. They would author frameworks. And they would, the supervisor said, try to help the Conclave understand what it was dealing with. Orish and Dow settled into their chair, across the desk from a supervisor who had never been within 6 sectors of a human in active crisis, and thought about the scuff marks on a boot heel, about a burned arm, patted out during a walk, about the word maybe used as a philosophy. "I'll need access to all flagged reports," they said, "not just the cleared ones, all of them. Some of those are Psychological Clearance 9, Orish and Dow said. "I have it. I'll need all of them." They got the reports. It took 3 weeks to read them. Not because there were so many, though there were many, but because each one required time. Not to analyze. Time to sit with. Time to let the particular quality of what was being described settle properly. But the way the title adjustment had taken 3 days on the second guess before Hevraal's colors went still. One report was from a hegemony military observer who had been embedded with a human unit during the Rim Corridor engagement. The observer had submitted a field assessment of human combat doctrine and had prefaced it with a note that the Hegemony Tactical Review Board had flagged as non-standard. The note read, in its entirety, "I need it on record that I did not understand what I was watching until the 3rd day. I believed at first that the humans were poorly organized. I understand now that their organization operates on a principle I do not have a classification for. They do not follow orders the way we follow orders. They follow intent. The difference is that when the command structure fails, and in the Rim Corridor, and it did fail, catastrophically in the 3rd hour, they do not stop. They find the nearest human and ask what needs doing, and then they do it." Another report from a Keth biological researcher stationed on a joint species scientific vessel. 17 pages of careful observation, gradually losing its clinical tone around page 9. By page 14, the researcher was describing a human colleague's response to a containment failure. They had been in the lab during the breach, had sealed it manually while the automated systems were rerouting, had developed a fever immediately after from the exposure, had continued working through the fever on the grounds that there was still data to recover, and had recovered from the exposure in a time frame the researcher described as significantly outside projected parameters for comparable biological trauma. I asked her how, the researcher wrote. She said she'd been sick before. I explained that the exposure was novel and her previous illness history was not directly applicable. She said she knew, but that her body didn't, not really. That it, her exact words, just sort of handles things. I have been reviewing human immune system literature for 6 days. I think I understand what she means, and I find it profoundly destabilizing. A third report from a diplomatic vessel, a collective defector transport of all things, an account of the 3 days the human crew had spent negotiating simultaneously with the collective enforcement vessels on their tail and the defectors in their hold. Some of whom were injured, some of whom did not trust each other, one of whom had information that several parties wanted badly enough to fire on a transport ship to suppress. The human mediator's approach, the observer wrote, had involved no leverage, no formal framework, no treaty architecture. She had simply talked to everyone, separately, together. She had found the thing each person was afraid of losing, and had talked about that, specifically, in a way that acknowledged its reality, not minimized it, not weaponized it, acknowledged it, and had moved between those conversations for 72 hours without sleeping. I do not know how she kept the parties separated in her mind, the observer wrote. Each conversation required a completely different framework, a completely different emotional register, and I watched her shift between them in real time. It was like watching someone speak 6 languages simultaneously, not translate, but think in each one, from the inside. I asked her afterward how she managed it. She said she'd been doing it her whole life, that you just pay attention to what matters to the person you're talking to. I said that sounded exhausting. She said, "Not really. You just have to care about the answer. You just have to care about the answer." Orcs and Dow added that line to the growing list in their private log, which had started on the second guess and had not stopped. The Human Liaison Office's first formal report, authored by Orcs and Dow, reviewed by 2 senior analysts who had requested significant portions be softened before distribution, and then republished in its original form at Orcs and Dow's insistence, was titled, "On the Question of Human Threat Classification." It ran to 40 pages, and its central argument was not what most conclave members expected. The argument was not that humans were dangerous. The argument was that the conclave had been asking the wrong question. "We have spent considerable institutional effort," the report began, "classifying humanity's capacity for threat. This is understandable. They are a death world origin species with documented adrenaline-mediated physical amplification, extraordinary biological resilience, persistence predator cognitive patterns, and a demonstrated willingness to engage in high-cost, low-certainty actions that other species would classify as irrational. The threat classification literature is extensive, and I do not dispute its findings. What I dispute is the framing. The question we have been asking is, what are humans capable of when threatened? The answer, as the attached reports document extensively, is considerably more than we expected in ways we continue to underestimate. The question we should be asking is, what are humans doing when they are not threatened? And the answer to that question, documented here across 16 species, 3 decades of contact, and 47 individual reports, is that humans are, without exception, doing something for which we have no adequate classification. They are forming attachments. They are building things. They are solving problems that are not their problems for people who cannot repay them, and in situations where the rational response is withdrawal. They are creating art and music in the middle of emergencies. They are learning other species' languages, not for diplomacy, but because they want to know what the words feel like. They are feeding people. They are carrying people out of burning buildings and then asking if those people are hungry. We are afraid of humans in battle. I understand why. I watched it happen. What I did not understand, for a long time, and what I am attempting to convey in this report, is this. The humans in battle and the humans who carry strangers through burning corridors are the same humans. What we call their capacity for violence and what we call their capacity for compassion are not separate features. They are the same feature, as expressing itself differently depending on what the situation requires. A species that will fight with everything it has is the same species that will care with everything it has. You cannot have one without the other. The galaxy is afraid of what happens when humans go to war. I would like to suggest that we have been overlooking what happens when they go to peace. The report landed, as Orish and Dow had expected, with the diplomatic equivalent of a stone dropped into a quiet pool. The ripples took time to reach the edges. There were 3 formal requests for clarification, 1 demand for retraction from a species that had a pending territorial dispute with human allied systems, and 1 response that arrived on Orish and Dow's desk 14 days after distribution, and from the hegemony military observer whose account they had cited in Section 4. The message was brief. It said, "I showed this to my commanding officer. He said it was too soft on them. I showed it to the junior officer who'd been with me in the Rim corridor. She read the whole thing and then sat for a long time and then said, 'I think the analyst is right, and I think we've been afraid of the wrong thing. I don't know what the right thing to be afraid of is yet. She's been thinking about it since. I thought you should know someone was thinking about it.'" Orish and Dow filed the message. They added it to the archive. They thought, good. Think about it. All of you, think about it. Then they went back to the reports, because there were always more reports. Under the meeting that changed everything happened 16 months after the liaison office was established, in a conference room on the Conclave's primary diplomatic station that had been chosen specifically because it was large enough to accommodate 8 species simultaneously without anyone being uncomfortably close to anyone else's atmospheric preferences. The meeting had been called about the Fold. The Fold was the working name for a gravitational anomaly in the outer rim that had been observed for approximately 30 years and ignored for approximately 28 of them on the grounds that it was stable, it was far from populated systems, and the Conclave had many more immediate problems. In the preceding 18 months, it had become not stable. The exact mechanisms were contested. The timeline of consequences was contested. What was not contested was that it was getting worse, and that if it continued getting worse at the current rate, 3 inhabited systems would be affected within the next 4 decades, and 2 of those systems were home to species that had not yet developed the technology to evacuate on their own. The meeting was to discuss the options. There were 7 official options on the table. Orish and Dow had read all of them. 3 involved doing nothing on the grounds that 40 years was far away. 2 involved monitoring without intervention on the grounds that the anomaly might stabilize. 1 involved a theoretical gravitational dampening array that would take at least a century to design and build. 1, submitted by the human representative to the conclave, was 40 pages long and featured prominently words like experimental and not fully tested, and, in one memorable passage near the end, "We'd need to run the numbers on this, but we think we can make it work." The human representative was Dr. Adeyemi, senior xenophysics attaché, a woman of approximately 50 human years who wore her gray hair in a complicated structure that Orish and Dow had never seen on another human, and who had the particular quality of stillness that Orish and Dow had come to associate with humans who had been in too many serious rooms and had stopped being intimidated by them. She presented her option in 45 minutes. She did not read from the document. She talked about it, the way Ihejirika had talked about the modified life support coupling, with the proud, careful enthusiasm of someone who had built something good and wanted you to understand how it worked. She drew diagrams on the conference room's display system. She answered questions. She said, "I don't know" 3 times in specific identified places without apparent embarrassment. The other representatives asked the obvious questions, the polite versions of, "This has never been done. This is theoretical. How do you know this will work?" Adeyemi said, "We don't. Not completely, but we know enough to try. And the alternative is 3 systems losing habitability while we wait for the perfect plan." Silence. The timeline for do nothing ends with two species that can't save themselves, she said. The timeline for try and fail ends with us learning what didn't work and trying again with better data. Those are different outcomes. Only one of them is acceptable. More silence. A long one. And the kind that fills a large room with 8 species worth of very careful thinking. Orcs and Dow had attended many long silences in their diplomatic career. They had learned to read them, the quality of attention in the room, the micro shifts of body language across species lines, the particular texture of a silence that was moving toward yes versus one moving toward not yet. This silence was complicated. This silence had layers. They watched the hegemony representative, a senior military diplomat named Vos Arak, whom Orcs and Dow knew by professional reputation and personal experience to be deeply skeptical of anything that had not been done before. Watching Adeyemi, not the display, not the diagram. Adeyemi herself. He's watching her the way Orcs and Dow had watched Reeves in the burning corridor, with the specific attention of someone trying to understand what they were looking at. Adeyemi met Vos Arak's gaze. She did not look away. "You have done this before," Vos Arak said. "Not quite a question. Not this specifically," Adeyemi said, "but humans have a long history of doing things that had never been done before. We usually break something in the process. We fix it. We refine. We try again." A pause. "We have a saying, done is better than perfect. I know that doesn't translate well." "It doesn't," Vos Arak said. "It means a working solution that exists is more useful than a perfect solution that doesn't, even if the working solution has problems. And you find the problems and you fix them." Vos Arak's secondary membrane, the one that indicated deep processing in their species, the biological signal of working hard on something, was extended. Had been extended since about minute 12 of Adeyemi's presentation. "And if it fails completely, then we have data we didn't have before, and we design the dampening array with that data, and we build it faster. It's 40 years. That's..." Adeyemi appeared to do brief mental arithmetic. "Approximately 4 human generations. We can do a lot in 4 generations. We built the conclave in less." Something shifted in the room. Orcs and Dow felt it more than saw it. A pressure change. A realignment of attention. Not agreement, not yet. Something earlier than agreement. The moment before agreement. When the resistance hasn't fully lowered, but the direction of movement has become clear. The Keth representative said, "What resources would you need?" And there it was. Adeyemi listed the resources. She had the list prepared. Of course she had the list prepared. She had come into this room knowing, somewhere, in the unhurried, forward-looking part of her that reminded Orcs and Dow of Reeves walking through the burning corridor, that the room would get to that question, and so she had the answer ready. The meeting lasted 4 more hours. The proposal was not approved that day. It went to committee, as all conclave proposals did, but it did not die in committee, as many conclave proposals did. It came back 6 weeks later, modified, expanded, with human and Keth and hegemony engineers attached, and it was approved with a majority vote that included, to Orcs and Dow's considerable personal satisfaction, Vos Arak. The Fold project would run for 11 years before producing results. During those 11 years, it would fail twice in small ways and once in a large way that required 2 months of redesign and a complete overhaul of the primary dampening mechanism. During those 11 years, the human and alien engineers involved would have, by various accounts, approximately 400 arguments, 3 interspecies working dinners that became annual events, 1 medical emergency, and 1 documented occasion where a Keth engineer taught a human engineer a traditional Keth structural calculation method that the human then applied to the array design in a way that the Keth had never thought to do, in solving a problem that had been blocking progress for 3 months. The anomaly stabilized. Not perfectly. It required ongoing monitoring and occasional adjustment. But it stabilized. 2 species kept their homes. Orish and Dow retired from the Human Liaison Office after 12 years of service. At their farewell, attended by diplomatic personnel from 9 species, 2 of whom had been cited in their reports, one of whom had once tried to get the first report retracted, they gave a brief address that people would quote in various contexts for a long time afterward. They said, "I was given this position because I survived an encounter with humanity under duress and wrote about it in terms that alarmed the psychologists. I want to say for the record that the psychologists were right to be alarmed, and that after 12 years, I remain alarmed, though not for the reasons I would have predicted on the day I first filed the report." They said, "We are afraid of humans in battle. I was afraid of humans in battle. I watched one of them run toward a burning room that I had a very rational desire to run away from, and I was afraid, not of the human, but of what it meant that a human would do that, what that implied about the species." They said, "What I understand now, and what I have tried to capture in 12 years of reports and 2 very long books, is that humans run toward burning rooms the same way they run toward unsolvable problems. The same way they run toward strangers who need help, and the same way they run toward each other in grief and in celebration and in the long, dull middle years when nothing dramatic is happening and you could be forgiven for not running at all. They don't actually make the distinction we imagine they make between emergency and daily life. They just move toward whatever needs them." They said, "I have spent 12 years trying to explain why the galaxy fears them. I would like to spend the rest of my life explaining why the galaxy needs them. I think those are the same explanation. I am still working on the wording." They went home. On their desk, in the private office where they had written both of the very long books, was a single object they had kept for 12 years, a small piece of hull plating from the second guess, given to them on a relay station docking bay by Ihajirika, who had been cutting new access panels and had pressed the offcut into Orish and Dow's hands and said so. "You've got something from the ship that brought you here," as if that was a complete and sufficient explanation, as if the idea of carrying pieces of things with you was so obvious it required no further discussion. Orish and Dow picked up the piece of hull plating and turned it in the light. It had a scuff mark on one edge. Old. Deep. Someone had leaned against this section of hull many times, hard enough to score the finish, or possibly it had collided with something. Or possibly it had been repaired after an impact, and the surface had never been fully refinished because the ship had other things to worry about and working was good enough. They had never asked. They didn't need to. They knew now what that mark meant. Or they had learned to read it. They had learned to read a great many marks like it, on hull plating, on hands, on the records of 11 years of work, on the faces of engineers who had stayed up too long solving problems that were not their problems, on the proposals of diplomats who walked into 8-species conference rooms carrying 40-page documents full of words like experimental, and we think we can make it work. Humanity's marks. Everywhere. On everything they had touched. Not the marks of conquerors. Not the marks of empire. The marks of a species that had run toward too many burning rooms to count and had come out the other side, somehow, still running, still looking for the next thing that needed them, still singing, under their breath, whatever song they sang, the one with no tactical value, the one that served no function except to keep the singer present, keep them moving, keep them human in the middle of everything that tried to make them otherwise. Orish and Dow set the hull plating down. Somewhere, right now, a human was running toward something. Maybe a burning room, maybe an impossible problem, maybe just a friend who needed them, in the ordinary, undramatic, completely unremarkable way that humans needed and answered one another every day in every system where they had spread. The galaxy feared them. The galaxy was not wrong to fear them. But it was missing, Orish and Dow thought, as they had thought in slightly different words for 12 years. The most important part. They weren't running at anything. they were running toward. And there was a word for that. Not in Velshani. In a language Orishen Dao had spent 12 years learning, imperfectly, with great effort and considerable joy. In that language, in the human language, the one that had given them a word for eating pain as if it were food, for carrying strangers as if it were obvious, for staying in burning buildings because maybe it mattered. In that language, the word was simple. Hope. They had been carrying it the whole time. Orishen Dao had simply needed to see it to know what it was.